It absolutely blows my mind when you look at video game prices today and you look at video game prices back in the 90s and you see them side by side and realize that, oh my gosh, we are still paying the same amount of money for video games today as we did over 30 years ago. How did we even afford these games back then?
Man, that's a lot of money sitting here.
But first, a word about this video's sponsor, Factor. Growing up in the 90s, nobody made a home-cooked Italian meal quite like my Aunt Michelle.
What are you doing? Smells great.
Chicken cutlets.
Like the old days, huh?
Yep.
Oh, man.
Ah, yes. I remember those days when life wasn't so busy and all your meals were made fresh for you. Thankfully, I've got Factor. Factor's delicious, ready-to-eat meals fit perfectly into my weekly schedule. It's amazing to me that meals of this quality came straight from their oven to my door. Every fresh, never-frozen meal is chef-crafted, dietitian-approved, and ready to eat in just 2 minutes. Choose from a weekly menu of 35 options, including popular options like Calorie Smart, Keto, Protein Plus, or Vegan and Veggie. Factor meals eliminate the hassle of prepping, cooking, or cleaning up. Simply heat and savor the good stuff. And Factor is flexible. Change your order up every week with plans from 4 to 18 meals per week. Or pause or reschedule your deliveries anytime. Head to Factor75.com or click the link below and use code 50RetroLife to get 50% off plus free shipping on your first Factor box. That's code 50RetroLife at Factor75.com to get 50% off plus free shipping on your first Factor box. Thank you, Factor, for sponsoring today's video. So I recently made a post on X about how it's absolutely insane that video game prices back in the 1990s were the same amount, if not more, than the prices they are today. And when you factor in inflation and how much the dollar is worth today compared to what it was worth back then, it's mind-boggling that anybody complains about video game prices these days.
Too much money, too much money.
I hear people today in the year 2025 complaining about games that cost $70. And I'm like, guys, this is crazy. I mean, I look back and I remember from flyers like this that Donkey Kong Country cost around the same money, but in 1994 dollars. Guys, if you factor in inflation, that's around $130 for a video game.
Huh? What?
Donkey Kong Country. This game cost $1 million to produce. Games these days, AAA titles, go anywhere from $200 to $300 million. That's exponentially more. Now we can go even further back and talk about games that came out in the early 80s and late 70s. You know, Atari 2600 games. Here we see a flyer for the most infamously bad and broken video game that ever came out back then. It nearly killed the industry. It did kill the industry for a while there. I'm talking about E.T. the Extraterrestrial.
It's coming soon, only from Atari, the video game that lets your family help E.T. get home. But only if you have an Atari video game system at home.
As you can see here, the sales price is around $25. After inflation, this is like spending $80 in today's money on the worst video game ever made.
No!
And this was the sales price. The game actually originally retailed for more when it first came out, before it was being discounted. Oh my gosh, guys. See, that's the thing. There were bad video games back then, and
you had to do your research. You had to avoid those games. I mean, a lot of people replying to my post on X made the excuse that games these days are released unfinished or broken, and game developers are trying to take advantage of gamers. You know, I get that happens, but it also happened back in the day. I mean, I can't tell you, growing up back then, how many terrible video games there were. I mean, guys, bad, practically broken video games have existed, and companies have tried to take advantage of consumers since the dawn of video games. I mean, one of the things that led to the crash back in 1983 was the fact that there were so many terrible video games flooding the market. But you learned to avoid those titles. And that's how I kind of equate things today. You know, these unfinished or broken games that come out, they're bad games. Just don't buy them. Focus on buying the good games. Focus on buying the finished and full and complete games by great developers who are not taking advantage of the consumer.
You love 3D Bubsy?
Yeah.
Bubsy? Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas.
I believe we live in a culture these days that just loves to complain. It's like they get up in the morning and that's the only reason, that's the first thing they hope to accomplish with their day is complaining about life or about gaming in this situation, modern day video games. And I try not to, you know, and if you're this person, hear me out. You have a right to say and do and feel however you want to feel. I'm just saying, I want to encourage people, anybody watching this, to not live a life of complaining. Think more about the positives. I recently got Final Fantasy Remake on the PlayStation 5, the upgraded PlayStation 5 version of Final Fantasy VII Remake. And I beat the game. I loved it. I got my money's worth. I actually got it digitally on sale for $20. And it was so worth the money. I would have paid more because, like, guys, it was a fantastic game. And you think about it, I spent $20 on this game. I can remember an NES game that I got on clearance on sale back in the day for around $20. And it was Stanley, The Search for Dr. Livingstone. And this game, I mean, this is like a bad game. We had it so rough back in the 90s and 80s because we didn't have the internet to just at our fingertips look up if a game was good or not. You had to have a magazine subscription to like Nintendo Power or, you know, Sega Visions magazine, and you had to hope that you would see the game that you were interested in and see if it had good reviews from the critics. And not all games got reviewed in the magazine. So many times we took gambles on video games, and we would plunk down $50 back in 1989, 1991 for a game that ended up being terrible. And this whole thing about DLC, oh my gosh, guys, look, we had DLC back in the 90s too. It was called Street Fighter II Turbo Edition. Yeah, when Capcom released Street Fighter II Turbo, you weren't just buying a brand new game, you know, spending $60, $70, sometimes more on a brand new Street Fighter game. No, Turbo Edition was basically the same game with a few more bells and whistles and extra characters. Like, it was such a scam on Capcom's part back then to fleece the consumer out of their money and market this thing as some sort of brand new Street Fighter II game. Oh my gosh, guys. And then they did it again with Super Street Fighter II. It's like they kept releasing Street Fighter II over and over again because they knew it was their cash cow and they were going to make so much money doing it. They knew people would keep buying it. And here's another example. Capcom, again. Capcom back then was almost like the EA of today, right? Final Fight on the Super Famicom. This game comes out, and it's missing one of the most favorite characters from the original Final Fight arcade game, Guy. So what do? People complained and they decide, you know what? Let's re-release the game with Guy, and we'll call it Final Fight Guy. Although this time we're just going to remove Cody and put Guy in it and sell it again for full price. You know, these kind of shady business dealings in the video game industry have been happening since way back then. You know, some people complain about modern games having the base game come out for like $60, but then they keep adding all this new stuff and special editions and collector's editions. And if you want to get the full game, you have to spend, $150, $200. I don't do it. Don't spend that money if you don't want to. If it's something you hate, don't give into it. Like, I don't like it either. I honestly don't like that companies are doing that, but I don't buy those games. I understand there's sort of a predatory nature to what some of these companies are doing, and I don't stand for that. I don't like that. I wish we could back away from that. But I'm just saying, guys, from a consumer's perspective, the cost of video games today for the base games and for great games that are fully developed and it's the full game you're getting, if you pick the right games out there, the games today cost so much less than what they did back in the day.
Look at that stack of games, boy.
Man, that's a lot of money sitting here.
And for those of you who complain about, oh, well, a game comes out and it's not finished and you have to get all these patches downloaded and there's day one patches and the company keeps updating the game. Look, I understand that that's different and it's weird and it's not great. I wish the whole game was done and finished like it was back in the day. But at the same time, a game like Cyberpunk 2077, let's look at Cyberpunk for a second. This game comes out and it is broken on day one. It totally sucks. Everybody's mad. The developers realize, though, they're like, man, we really screwed up. We got to right this wrong. So over time, they keep updating the game and fixing it. And over time, it becomes a wonderful game that people love now. And sure, I wish it was like that out of the box. But that's the beauty of games these days, is that you can fix it. Developers that actually care will keep working on it and make sure that it's fantastic. Back in the day when a game came out, if it was bad, it was bad forever. There were no patches. There were no fixes. You just got what you got. I mean, games back then, Batman Forever on the Super Nintendo Sega Genesis, what a steaming pile. That game was horrible, and it should never have been released in the state that it was in. Completely taking advantage of consumers with the Batman franchise and how hot that movie was. There were broken games like Club Drive on the Atari Jaguar, and there was a lot of broken games on the Atari Jaguar if you want to look at that console. But back in the 90s and 80s, there was so much more risk and less reward when it came to being a gamer. It's so crazy to me, the amount of complaining that we have today from these young gamers. I can only assume they're young gamers that really didn't live through the time. And if they're not, if they lived through it, they're forgetting. Or maybe they didn't spend the money themselves. Maybe they didn't actually spend their hard-earned money on these games back in the day. Maybe it was their parents who bought it for them. But I'm telling you, if my dad were still here today, he would completely agree with me.
That was incredible. And next time we'll see you probably after Christmas, because who can afford to buy any more games?
I mean, he was the one, along with my mom, but especially my dad, he was the one that bought all these games back then. Or even my aunt and uncle and my cousins, My cousins were a lot like me. They got tons of games too. But our parents worked hard. Our parents, man, they really sacrificed when I think about it. Like, that's the thing. Like, I am so thankful. I am so grateful for what our parents did for us. As a dad myself these days, buying games for my girl, I get it now. You know, I really understand that it was a sacrifice. It was, my dad, he could have saved up all that money that he spent on me to buy me these video games. He could have saved that money and maybe bought a boat or bought a new electric guitar or any number of things for himself that were expensive, adult items, but he didn't. He loved buying me things, and he loved seeing me find joy in those things and sharing in that joy with me. And here's the thing, guys. I mean, inflation continues to make everything in our society rise in price. Housing, cost of eggs, cost of food, going to a restaurant, fast food, you name it. Everything has gone up. The cost of living has gone up, but the amount of money we spend on video games has stayed the same. It's the only thing that stayed the same. Really, when you look at it, it's crazy to me. It's so crazy that the cost of games have not gone up. Games cost more money back in the 80s and 90s, so much more. I mean, I haven't even scratched the surface with Sega Genesis and Super Nintendo. I mean, a game like Virtua Racing on the Sega Genesis with the special chip that they put inside it to make that game playable, that retailed for like $90 in 1994. But you saved up your money and you bought it and you got it and you made it work. Like, that's what we did. We did our research, and the great games that came out at that price, we made it happen. Look at like Neo Geo. Oh my gosh, the games cost $200 a pop for Neo Geo. Now, that was like the Rolls Royce of video games back then, and you had to be well off and have a lot of money to have a Neo Geo. My family, they did pretty well for themselves, upper middle class, but like, we couldn't afford a Neo Geo. I never owned a Neo Geo. And then you look at, I recently did a video on the 3DO, and my dad refused to buy a 3DO because it retailed for $700 in 1993. I mean, what are we even talking about here, guys? That's like, that's like a $1,600 console. You're going to spend $1,600 today on a console? No, nobody would buy that. So the next time you feel the urge to complain about modern day video game prices, hold on a minute and let's think about the past. That's what this channel's all about. Think about what it cost to buy video games back then, which were roughly the same price as they are today. It's crazy to me how affordable video games actually are these days compared to what they were back in the day. Well, that's about it for this video, guys. I hope you weren't too triggered by this subject. I know for a lot of you out there, money and prices and video games and the economy and this sort of thing could be a bit of a dicey subject, but I wanted to do this video because more than anything, when I look at modern day video game prices, I actually don't look at it in a negative light. I actually see it and I'm like, oh my gosh, like, I remember how much games cost back in the 90s when I was growing up, and we actually have it so good today. I'm thankful that video games do not cost more than what they are today. I'm thankful I can actually afford video games, because there's a lot of factors that tell me video games should actually cost a whole lot more, but thankfully they don't. If this is your first time to the channel, do consider subscribing. I love talking about my game crazy family and all of the amazing adventures we had with video games, so many of which were caught on tape by Dad. All right, guys, that's it for this video. Thanks so much for watching. Hey, go out and buy yourself a game. They are very affordable, especially compared to back in the day. I'll catch you next time.
Bye.